So in this video, we're going to be checking out some facts about how English loanwords work in Maori. And this is going to be a lot like the sort of abstract diagram that I started the last section with, where we have a whole bunch of totally unrestricted inputs and then a black box of grammar that filters those inputs down to forms that are actually attested in the language. But here we're actually going to be able to see the input to output mappings much more clearly because we know what English words sound like when they come into Maori, and so it's going to be a useful exercise. Now, this is not necessarily the main focus of phonological theory, but it's just an example that lets us see really clearly how phonological mappings work. We're going to be looking at other kinds of evidence about phonological mappings later in the semester, but this is just a really clear example. So remember from last week that Maori has a fairly restricted inventory of sounds, more restricted than English for sure, and fairly strict constraints on sequences of sounds as well. Again, here are the rough phonemic inventories of consonants and vowels in Maori. It has 9 phonemic consonants, or 9 contrastive consonants, and 5 contrastive vowels. Again, this world's most common a, e, I, o, u vowel system. And so obviously that's a lot fewer sounds than English. English has a lot more vowels than that, and some more consonants as well. Excuse me. Beyond that, there's this constraint in Maori that consonants are always followed by vowels in this language. So you don't ever have a consonant at the end of a word in Maori. You don't ever have 2 consonants next to each other. If you have a consonant, it's always followed by a vowel. And that obviously is much more restricted than English as well, where you can get all sorts of sequences of consonants at the beginnings of words, middles of words, ends of words. Not everything, of course. There are some sequences of consonants that don't exist in English, but you have a lot more than you have in Maori. So what would happen if Maori speakers had to deal with a whole bunch of unpronounceable English words and produce them as grammatical outputs? Around the year 1800, the Maori saw a large influx of English people and English words. And I don't mean to gloss over in any way here the horrors of the European conquest of Oceania and New Zealand. This is a horrifying period in history, and there are atrocities committed by all parties concerned. I'm going to totally ignore that and just focus on the phonological issues at hand here. I do suggest, if you're interested in this, go read about the European settlement or conquest of Oceania and New Zealand in particular. It's a fascinating, sort of awful story that's worth finding out about, but we're not going to find out anything at all about that in this class except for the phonological part of it. Okay, so that aside, here's what happens. You're getting all these English words that are being borrowed by Maori speakers during this period, like silk, English, blue, football, sheep, strike, cheese, and scholarship. And each one of these words ends up being adapted into Maori, in most cases because there are no native words for this concept, because the concept arrived along with the Europeans. Some other cases there might be some other explanation. And the observation here is that these come out in Maori with different phonological forms, and those are shown in the right columns here. And so here's a broad question. I don't need every detail in every natural class, but looking at these data broadly, what's going on here? Well, I mean, broadly speaking, they're changing these English inputs so that they're acceptable Maori outputs. That's the sort of broad picture of what's going on here, which is exactly what you would expect to have happen if phonology is a generative system of constraints and rules and generalizations that can be applied to novel inputs, even in adulthood when you've already acquired your lexicon. If it's a freely productive system, this is exactly what you'd expect. If we want to use this word in Maori, we have an ability to set our grammar on any unrestricted number of input items that are not pronounceable in our language, and a way of mapping those to things that are acceptable Maori words, even if those words happen not to exist until now. So this is exactly what we've been looking for. So we know that Maori imposes constraints on possible sounds and sequences of sounds. And what we're seeing here is that many of these carry through into the loanword grammar. So taking a look at these words, for instance, we know that Maori doesn't allow words to end in consonants, yet the English word sheep ends in a consonant. And correspondingly, we find that Maori speakers, when they adopt this word, add in an extra vowel at the end so that the word won't end in a consonant, hippie. You can notice in that one as well that they've replaced this strident fricative sh, the post-alveolar voiceless fricative from English, with a glottal fricative h, and that's because Maori doesn't have any strident fricatives. Right? There are no sounds like sh, s, z, or anything like that. And so they've mapped that post-alveolar fricative to a glottal one. Maori doesn't allow sequences of two consonants. So for instance, words like blue that start with two consonants, again, a vowel gets added to break up those two consonants in Maori, and instead you wind up with puru. Now there's other changes going on there. We saw that Maori has no lateral sounds, so star plus lateral, that's being imposed on this input. You end up with the rhotic tap instead. There's no voiced obstruents in Maori, and so that voiced obstruent, voiced stop, b, the voiced labial stop, becomes a voiceless labial stop, pa. Right? So the grammar here is not just imposing Maori grammatical constraints on English words, it's also allowing us to see what the actual mappings are from possible but illegal structures in the Maori input into actual output structures. So this grammar is not just accepting or rejecting different sequences, it's also mapping unacceptable strings onto acceptable ones. And this, at a first glance, is basically what we've said a grammar is. It's a system of implicit knowledge that allows you to map any conceivable input onto a possible word in your language. That is a phonological grammar, more or less. Important thing to note here, this might seem obvious, but it's actually going to be important in our theory. It's not mapping these English strings onto Maori outputs in completely arbitrary ways. There's a generalization here about how this mapping is working. Right? So for instance, the word cheese has a whole bunch of things that are impossible in Maori, and it's mapping onto tihi, not, for instance, pihi. So this English sound ch is a coronal affricate, and it's not possible in Maori, it's not a possible sound, but they're mapping it onto a coronal stop and not a labial stop. So why would that be? Sheep maps to hippie, not to hupu. So there's a bunch of things that aren't possible in sheep, but in Maori it maps in one particular way, and it doesn't change the vowel to u in addition to doing that mapping. Why not? Well, here's one way of thinking about this. The grammar is mapping English strings to possible Maori outputs, but also fairly similar Maori outputs. Right? So they're basically mapping English strings onto the closest acceptable Maori output while still remaining mostly within the constraints of Maori sound structure. Oh, and this refers to a point in the paragraph above. Can you find any exceptions where these English strings have been mapped onto something that isn't acceptable in normal Maori words? There's one example in here, and it's the word football, which gets mapped onto hutu pa'aru in Maori. What's wrong with that? Well, we saw earlier that Maori native vocabulary has a constraint against labial continuants that are followed by round vowels. It looks like, in the case of this English loanword, that constraint is violated. So, interestingly, loanword grammar does mostly impose native grammatical patterns onto unacceptable strings, but there are cases like this where sometimes some constraints are allowed to be violated in the loanword grammar that can't be violated in the native grammar. And how to model that or think about that is a pretty complicated issue that we're not going to solve here, but I did just want to point this out, that while the loanword grammar is mostly like the native Maori one, there are always going to be a few differences. So this is one particular example of how this mapping works from one particular language to a different particular language. And this is just loanword adaptation. Right? But it's actually an excellent illustration of how we think all of phonology basically works. It's just not always so obvious to see. What did I do with my chalk? Good enough. Okay, so step one. The grammar receives some kind of input. Now this might be an underlying representation from your lexicon, right? If you're an English speaker, maybe you're just pronouncing the word sheep and you have this memorized in your lexicon. But it could also be a loanword from a foreign language. It could be a hypothetical word that some linguist is asking you to judge for well-formedness. It could be a novel word that you've never heard before while you're processing a sentence in your native language. That happens all the time. There's a lot of possibilities for what this input could be. We don't think that phonology works in a fundamentally different way when you're receiving loanword inputs than when you're creating new lexical items or learning the patterns in your lexicon. Right? Step 2 has a couple parts. The grammar is going to produce from that input an output that conforms to grammatical principles if the input doesn't already. And we're going to model this using markedness constraints. So in the Maori example, relevant constraints here don't have stridents, don't have consonants at the end of a word, and so on and so forth. So there's going to be, a long list of Maori constraints. This input is going to get fed through here, and it's going to come out as some output that conforms to Maori phonotactic rules. I think I'm running out of space on the board here, so let me actually put this over to the side, where the output in this particular case is going to be hipi. Now, if this black box happened to be English grammar, instead, we would expect a different set of constraints to determine the output, or we'll fix that slightly in a moment, and we would expect a different output, namely sheep. Right? But this being Maori, we can see that the function works that way, and our job is to reconstruct what has to be in the middle here in this box of grammar. Right? So we're going to model this using markedness constraints, but simultaneously, and this is the ingredient that we're missing so far, keeping the output as similar as possible to the input. So, I gave some examples above where even though this fricative is impossible, it still maps to another fricative in the language instead of some totally different kind of segment. There's even more extreme examples, right? So this isn't possible because it ends in a consonant. So for Maori, you can't do that. And Maori solves this by inserting a vowel at the end of a word, but it doesn't just randomly insert a whole bunch of other stuff, right? It doesn't map this to kipitakuno or something like that, adding 3 syllables for no reason. And why not? Because again, we're looking for an output that conforms to Maori grammar, but is also relatively similar to the input, and adding a whole bunch of random stuff for no reason would create dissimilarity from the source word, from the input, that really isn't motivated and doesn't accomplish any purpose. Now this might seem obvious, but we're going to need a system of grammar that enforces that requirement somehow. We already have parts of grammar that can enforce these kinds of phonotactic conditions. That's our markedness constraints. But what's going to enforce the similarity between input and output? Well, the next section is going to talk about that component of grammar. It's the second major part of this theory of phonology called optimality theory, which is what we're approaching in this part of the class. The first big part is markedness constraints, and those are super important. The second big part is a different kind of constraint that regulates the relationship between inputs and outputs and prevents us from making unnecessary changes to inputs that don't serve any purpose. So again, all these examples are from one specific loanword adaptation phenomenon in these two languages that happened once in the history of humans. And to be clear, there's nothing special about this English to Maori loanword adaptation. So it's a particularly clear case, which is why I like to use it in this class. And it may seem like an exceptional historical circumstance, but it's not. This happens all the time. Right? So at a first pass, more than half of the English lexicon is based on loanwords from French. Japanese has 3 roughly equally sized parts of its lexicon, one of which is native Japanese words, one of which is ancient loanwords from Chinese, and one of which is more modern loanwords from mostly English, although some other languages as well. And so this is totally common, right, for languages to borrow words from one another. And here are some examples from English. Here's the composer, the Baroque composer, B-A-C-H. How do we pronounce that in English? Well, in German it's going to be something like Bach, where that final sound is a velar fricative in German. Obviously not possible in English. What do you do with this? Well, interestingly, there's a couple different solutions here. The most common one for sort of normal non-musician people, I think, is to map this to a velar stop and pronounce this Bach. So again, we're imposing English grammatical constraints on a German input that doesn't conform to English sound patterns. Now, there's a different sociolinguistic thing going on here, where if you're very involved with the music world and you want to sound sophisticated, you might allow this sound into the English pronunciation, even though it's otherwise not allowed, and pronounce this Bach or something like that. And you do find that in classical music circles. And so the point here is that there's going to be different sociolinguistic registers. It probably depends on how much you identify with German culture or want people to know that you can speak German. Similarly, for the next one, which is a kind of sausage, how do you generally pronounce that in English? I would say Knackwurst, even though the German input is surely something like and this one is going to be a velar approximant with a probably rhotic vowel here. Not 100% sure about every part of that German transcription, but it's going to be something like Knackwurst. And number of sounds in there are unpronounceable in English, including this initial kna sequence. So in general, this is going to be repaired by English grammar and come out as either Knackwurst or Knackwurst. I'm not sure which I prefer there. So again, we're going through English grammar in the middle here, imposing our constraints on a German word. This is fundamentally the same kind of thing that's going on from English to Maori. Right? Another couple examples here from me. Oh, there's another German example here. The surname spelled that way, which in German is going to be Pfeiffer, begins with a labiodental affricate, which isn't a sound in English. And that's going to be loaned in as just a fricative in English, as Pfeiffer, right, or something like that. Similarly, from French, we have words like rendezvous, which I'm probably pronouncing a little bit exaggerated and ridiculous, but that's going to have a nasal vowel in it, rendezvous. Obviously, no nasal vowels in English, so how are we going to pronounce that in English? Rendezvous. Right, so we repair it to be a vowel plus nasal sequence. Another one here, déjà vu, which means already seen in French. And that second word, vu, is a past participle of the verb to see. And it has a high front rounded vowel, u, in it. not pronounceable in English, and so that's going to be mapped onto oo, right? Déjà vu. This is an older loan word that's probably been in English for several hundred years. You might not even think of it as a loan word, but it comes from French. Débutante. Oh, I messed that up. Débutante. Right? This has both a high front rounded vowel, début, and a nasal vowel, tant. And it means somebody who's debuting. This took on a particular social significance in older American culture. And it's not going to be pronounced débutante unless you really want to show people that you are a good French speaker. The general pronunciation of this in English is going to impose English phonotactics on it and make it debutante. So lots of changes there, forcing words from other languages to conform to the constraints of English grammar, just as we find in Maori. Another example here, and I put this one in because it's a totally unrelated language spoken in a different part of the world. Yoruba is a language spoken in Nigeria. It's 100% unrelated to Maori and English, yet you can see some very similar things happening when you get English loanwords into Yoruba. And so I've left out the tones here. This is also a tone language, but that's mostly irrelevant to what we're looking at here. And the point is, Yoruba has similar constraints to Maori in some ways, so it also doesn't allow final consonants. You loan in a word with a final consonant, like sick, and you get out a word with a parenthesized or added vowel at the end, siki. Similarly, Maori doesn't allow sequences of Yoruba doesn't allow sequences of two consonants next to each other, so in an input like address, you get the output arereesi, where there's a vowel inserted in between the two consonants. We saw that in Maori as well. Now, some of the specific sound patterns here are going to be different because Yoruba has a different inventory of sounds than Maori does. For instance, it has no problem mapping strident fricatives to a Yoruba sound because they have strident fricatives. But in general, some of the general strategies here are going to be the same mapping English words to Yoruba as they are to Maori. So this is just trying to say that although the English to Maori loanword situation might seem historically exceptional to you, it's not in any way unusual. This kind of loanword adaptation happens all the time.